brakes essentially on the U.S. doing any real thorough investigation. And so what was left, the senior officials at the NSA, was essentially educated guesswork. They did get confirmation, according to one of the senior NSA officials, that Israel had in fact green-lighted the attack. But as for motive, they were left only with guesswork. Came down to, in their view, essentially Israel wanted an impenetrable defense line. The Liberty was a spy ship. It was parked there off the coast of Egypt at a time when they were reallocating their forces from Egypt up to Syria, and they weren't going to take any risks. And I have a quote from one official in the book that I'll paraphrase now, which he said, Israel's our ally, but when it comes to their national security, they will take no chances. And so that even meant in the case of the Liberty, they'd be willing to sideline an American ship. So that's the view of the senior folks at the NSA that work this problem. Yes, sir.
Did you ever find, because I've read that there may have been some submarine surveillance and also aerial surveillance, did you ever find any support for that in your research?
I did, actually. Well, there's been talk
Can you go to the mic, please?
I'm afraid it's going to start whistling again. So, there's been talk over the years, just keep it back a little bit. There's been talk over the years that there was a submarine that was there and photographed the attack on the Liberty. And that's kind of floated around out there, I think, is on the internet. If you look, you'll see some of that. And the reality is, in the course of my research, actually, I got access to Admiral John McCain's, current Senator John McCain's father, actually, was Sinkus Navyur at that time period in London. And his deputy actually wrote some letters about the Liberty that survived him. He's since passed away, Admiral Wiley, in which he actually talks about the submarine. And what happened is, according to his version, is that actually they pulled that submarine when the hostilities broke out. And at that point, they then drafted because the submarine operated purely under Navy control. They had the authority, they drafted an order, had the submarine pulled. They then drafted a similar order and gave it to Admiral McCain to pull the Liberty as well. The Liberty had a unique set of operational orders in that it was a Navy ship, yes, but it was operated, as part of this program with the NSA through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And Admiral Wiley said that McCain was a very political animal, and that he was very worried about ruffling any feathers. So he sat on it. And then, sure enough, June 8th rolled around, and the order never went in, and the Liberty was attacked as a result of that. But he did address the fact that the submarine was, in fact, pulled out earlier. And I have no reason to doubt that's not the case.
What about aerial surveillance?
There was the United States at that time was actually flying airborne missions, Navy missions out of Athens, and we did have a spy plane that was in the general vicinity, but they only intercepted the communications after the attack, and it was some helicopters that were sent out. And those helicopters actually, they did confirm, one of the important pieces of information is they did confirm the fact that the Liberty was flying an American flag, because the Israelis disputed that and said, oh, it wasn't flying an American flag, it was unmarked or whatnot. But the little bit of intercepts that we got after the attack from some of their helicopters in the area confirmed the fact that the Liberty was in fact flying its American flag.
Jim, much earlier that day, as you know, the Israelis had identified the Liberty according to a Jane's manual. And how do you account for the long delay in that information, if ever, getting to the Air Force? They knew many, many hours before that the Liberty had been identified.
Yeah, no, they did. They actually, that flight, that initial recon flight that morning was out, the one that my father witnessed. They actually landed, they got the hull number off the ship, they looked it up, and they put that information in. And even by Israel's own account, they put it on their plotting board. And they just said during a shift change right before the attack, someone accidentally took the Liberty's plug off of the plotting board, and therefore it was as if the ship had never been there, and they didn't know it was there and attacked anyway. But that was a rationale that I think people inside the U.S. administration found pretty hard to swallow, that it was there and it wasn't there.
We talked a little bit about it at the table beforehand. It's, I think, based upon your own research and research I personally have done and the obviousness of the situation, I think it's inconceivable that Israel did not understand that this was an American ship when it went in for the attack. So the question really, that's the big question to me, and I'm interested in your response to that, is why would Israel knowingly attack a ship which they knew to be an American at a time when their own country was in peril? And the arguments that have been asserted, just to go through this by some others who've researched this issue, is that they feel that this was a deliberate attack by Israel after they determined that the United States had compromised its military plans and delivered it through the CIA and through the British to the Arabs, and that they could no longer tolerate this as they were planning on moving on.
Yeah. What Nicholas Katzenbach told me is that they thought that in the administration that the Israelis were worried about what the Liberty. They didn't know exactly what the Liberty was getting, but they were worried about what it could be getting, and so they were really worried. Like, it wasn't so much the devil that you know; it's the devil that you think you know, and so that they weren't exactly sure what all we were getting, but they weren't willing to take that chance as to what we were going to get and take those risks. So. But again, the department where the torpedo hit actually was in the NSA space, and so all the information and intelligence that they had gathered that day was lost. It was all destroyed.
One of the overflights was allegedly by a flying boxcar with very sensitive information, and was picking up very specific information being transmitted to Cyprus by the ship, which detailed the positions of all of the Israeli operational units, giving a battle map to the Arabs.
Yeah, some of that I think is a little, the Liberty actually was not transmitting anything to Cyprus. I mean, they would gather it all up and they would typically go in and put it all in a diplomatic pouch, drop it off in an embassy, and it would be flown back that way. They had limited capability for actually being able to send signals back. They had this huge dish on the back, that was the Treshcom, but they could send out at about 100 words a minute if they had. It was like a relay that bounced off the surface of the moon. And that was about as high-tech equipment as they had to be able to do that. So, and that was directed only to go back to Maryland. So the idea that they were sending stuff to Cyprus that way, just the technology wasn't there for them to do that.
So why would Israel knowingly attack a ship by its foremost ally?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as the folks in the NSA said at that time period, it was a matter of they wanted an impenetrable defense line. That when it comes down to Israeli national security, they're not going to take any chances. And an American ship, out there when they don't know where the information's going, what they're getting, was a threat to that. Now, the U.S. government thought that it was a decision made, a tactical military decision, as opposed to a civilian political decision. And that was part of the reason why the U.S. government was willing to let it go away. They figured that a senior officer somewhere, probably in the Sinai or in a war room there in Tel Aviv, was making a tactical command decision. And it wasn't something that the Prime Minister was saying, all right, now we're going to go ahead and we're actively going to attack a U.S. ship, and it's going to be the end of relations. And so as a result of that, they were more willing to let it go.
Follow on that, I'm sorry, was there precedence for attacking ships?
No, actually, the thing is, and that's a good point. These ships were spy ships, and everybody, sophisticated militaries like ours and Soviets, as well as unsophisticated militaries like where the Liberty was on the coast of West Africa, knew exactly what these ships did. The USS Oxford was one of the Liberty's sister ships, and it was parked off of Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Navy would come out and they would put their fire control radar on it, and they harassed it and whatnot. And in fact, the Liberty had done 4 missions prior to the mission on which it was attacked. And on those cruises, these relatively unsophisticated West African navies would come out and harass it as well. So, I mean, and that's kind of, I think, what Dr. Tordell is addressing in that handwritten memo there at the end is that, doesn't do credit to the Nigerian Navy as sort of in reference to the fact that the Liberty was harassed even on its earlier mission. So, in that kind of, Israel had a very sophisticated military, and for them to claim, hey, we didn't know what this lone ship is that is bristling with antenna, so much so that it looks like a porcupine, as one of the admirals said at that time period, when, hey, the Nigerian Navy, the Cuban military, everybody else seems to know exactly what they are. It sort of defied logic for them.
We got time for like 3 more, so questions, quick, real quick.
Sorry.
Just a point here. Obviously, we recognize Israel in 48.
Ron, question, please.
The question is basically this. In 1956, the United States chose the side of Egypt. Someone said this would never happen again, that the United States would be on the side of somebody not on Israel's side, pushing back the French and the English and the Israelis. The question is, we were all junior officers or something in that time period, but the point is 10 years before is not a long time if you're 40 or 50 or 60 years old. So were they still thinking about the fact that we might tell them to buck off or something?
But there was some discussion.
Limit their victory?
There was some discussion that some of these commanders who were in these tactical leadership roles at that time would have been there during the Suez Canal crisis and would have remembered that as well. And so you have to remember there's only about a 10-year difference there from the Suez Canal crisis, and so they would have certainly viewed it through that lens. So that could have been a factor, and they talked about that in the United States, as whether or not that hangover of the Suez Canal crisis played a role in the decision-making process.
Over here, Jim Traeger.
Okay, there was a reference in your book
Yeah.
to an instruction from the CNO, which
Yes.
would have been superior to Admiral McKean, that claimed that the Liberty be removed
Yes.
from to 100 miles from
Yes.
the coast. Whatever happened to that order, which could have theoretically prevented
Prevented
this whole
it.
thing from happening?
Exactly. What he's talking about is on June 7th, the Chief of Naval Operations had his sort of daily operational notes or whatever. There was 2 sentences at the very end that said, USS Liberty is going to be steaming 12.5 miles off the Egyptian coast, 6.5 miles off the Israeli coast. He immediately said, this is a bad idea. He told his executive, his senior aide, he said, the ship needs to be pulled farther back. Take care of it. I'm on my way to Annapolis for the day. When I get back, it better be done. He came back that afternoon, and as he was headed out the door on the evening of June 7th, his assistant said, all right, the Joint Chiefs are going to pull it back 20 miles now instead of the 12 and a half. And he said, I wouldn't even let her go down that way now. It's exactly what he wrote in his memo. Pull the ship all the way back 100 miles where to where the orders are for the rest of the Sixth Fleet. Take care of it. So they then began at that point, picked up the phone, called over to Sincus Navier in London, try to get a hold of the ship or whatnot. Sent off half dozen messages that were, a few of which were routed to other places, including the Philippines, all of which never arrived in time for the Liberty to actually pull farther back. And the Liberty was, in fact, attacked as a result of
Got
that. So,
one over here, or 2 over here.
okay.
Were there unfriendly ships? Were there Egyptian ships in the area as well?
There's nothing
Or-
in the area. There's absolutely nothing out there. I mean, in fact, actually, if you talk to Liberty sailors, they about 2 days prior they saw their last ship, and then it was just completely empty ocean out there. So Egypt, had a very small and sophisticated navy at that time period. In fact, if you look them up in 1967, the Jane's fighting ships, it's like a page and a half. And they would have also, their argument was, well, it looked like this Egyptian ship, the El Kasur, which if you look at that in Jane's fighting ships, it's the same as the Liberty. It's a horse and troop transport with no real armament. It's not an offensive ship like you would expect to find something like a cruiser or destroyer. So
Has any Israeli military or politician said that they were ordered to do this? And one other question. Comment on Bamford's book.
Yeah.
With NSA.
yeah, no. In fact, Israel. I went over and spent actually a couple weeks in Israel, and I interviewed pretty much everyone that was involved in Liberty that would agree to be interviewed. And there are not as many as you would hope that are willing to talk about it. But those that I did talk to, all say that hey, it was just a tragic accident, etc. And James Bamford. I don't know what you want me to comment on James Bamford's book.
He said NSA knew what happened.
Yeah, Bamford has written about the Liberty on a number of occasions. Body Secrets, Puzzle Palace. He's done terrific books on the NSA. If you ever get a chance to read them and have it. I think Bamford's had wonderful sources inside the NSA, a number of whom I talked to as well. And his information is on par with the same. They're telling him what they tell me as well, so that they all believe it. If you talk to these senior officials at the NSA, they're all unanimous in that none of them believed it was an accident. I showed you a couple quotes from some of these guys. They were all pretty adamant. And these were individuals who were in the know at that time. They had access to all the files. They were there. They were living that current context in which we're looking back into. So.
And final thing, Commander's privilege, as having read the very end, you paid a visit to Israel. Your dad did not go with you when you visited one of the pilots.
Yeah.
Could you?
Actually, I went to Israel to do research in 2007, and my father went with me, and he was interested in going over there. And so when we went, he said, look, if any of these guys you interview or want to meet me, I'm more than happy to do it. As one of my dad's shipmates said, he was probably the most well-adjusted man who walked off that ship, and harbors no ill will. So we went over on a father and son trip, and I was one of the pilots, the guy who led the initial wave of the attack, called him up, and he said, I don't want to be interviewed, but I'll agree to have coffee with you. And I said, okay, I'll come over for coffee. And so I went, and I was sitting in his house in the suburbs outside of Tel Aviv.
With your father?
No, my dad's back at the hotel, and so I was he was asking me how my trip was in Israel. I told my father and I were here together. And he asked me, he goes, why are you interested in Liberty? It's 40 years ago. And I said, well, my dad was one of the officers on the ship. And his eyes got real big, and he said, but your dad's here in Israel with you? And I said, yes, he's back at the hotel. And he said, well, why didn't you bring him with you? And I said, well, I thought that might be awkward. And he said, nonsense, I want to meet him. I insist on meeting him, call him. And so I had a cell phone with me, so I called my dad and I invited him over. And so my dad came over, and this pilot actually was Yifta Spector, who's a very legendary pilot in the Israeli Air Force. In fact, he had led or participated in the attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor in the 1980s, and sort of a legendary fighting ace. And so he came over, and he was over there at the time. He was building a swing set for his grandkids in his backyard. He's about 3 years older than my dad was at the time, and he's all sweaty and whatnot. Here's my dad, and they came face to face, and Spector went right up to my dad, and my dad's an imposing guy. He's almost 6'5". He's 6'4". He's really tall, and here's a pilot who's a good bit shorter, and he goes right up to him, sticks his hand out, and says, I'm sorry, I apologize for it all. And my dad thanked him, and they chatted for a little bit about it. And but I know for my father, it was a really powerful personal experience. As he said, look, I was immediately shipped off to Vietnam. Not long after that, no one in the government, no one ever in the Navy ever said, hey, we're sorry you guys went through this. We just went to Vietnam. And he said, here is the first apology for it all coming from, one of the pilots who had led the attack. And so it meant a lot to him. He picked up, we were driving in a taxi cab to Jerusalem. He called my mom on his cell phone back in the U.S., which I'm sure was probably a $200 phone bill, just to relate that experience that he had there. So it was certainly a very, very powerful thing.
I think as Rich, did you have a comment, and then we'll end with this.
Given the fact that this was your father,
Yeah.
and I know my emotions are all over the map.
Yeah.
Two questions. What would you like to see going forward, and how do we go forward?
Yeah, there's been a lot of the Liberty veterans have pushed for years for a new investigation. As you can see, the Court of Inquiry was incredibly shallow. They were barred, and I didn't mention the thing, but they were barred from actually going to Israel. The investigators, the Navy investigators wanted to go to Israel and talk to the attackers, get their war logs. They were told, you're not going to go do any of that, come back with what you got. So we only got that one side of the story, basically. And so there's been a lot of veterans have pushed for a new investigation. Honestly, I don't think that will ever happen. The United States the world is such a busy place, and there's so much going on that I just don't see that happening. But what I could see happening that I think would actually mean a lot to the veterans would be like what happened in the case of the USS Indianapolis, when the skipper of the Indianapolis later committed suicide, but I think it was back around 2000 or so, when Congress did a resolution, if I recall, and it's basically saying, you weren't given all the facts, and you were basically hung out to dry, and did that as a resolution. Sort of helped tie it off, I think, that way. And I think there could be something like that, a gesture like that, would really end it for a lot of these men. I think would be a real sense of closure for them, and I think would be a great thing for the government to do. So, as for where we go forward, one of the points I try to argue in the book is that, 7 months after the attack on the Liberty, North Korea seized the Pueblo. It was the exact same type mission. There they were off the coast of North Korea. And Pete Bucher, who was the skipper of the Pueblo, later said he didn't know anything about the Liberty at the time, and he said, had I known about the Liberty, there was no way I ever would have taken my ship there. And in fact, I talked to one of the breach analysts at the NSA at that time period. His job was to determine when things like the Liberty happened or the Pueblo, how serious were these threats to national security? And he said the Pueblo was without a doubt the biggest breach in American national security in modern history, because that ship, combined with the stuff that all that was passed on to the Soviets, which was then passed on to North Vietnam, would come back to haunt us for years to come. And so there were certainly lessons, I think, that could have been learned from the Liberty that might have prevented the Pueblo. It's one of the points I make in the book. And there's actually, the last thing I'll say, there's if you read the entire 500 or so published pages of the Pueblo court hearings before Congress, there's one exchange between Admiral Thomas Moore and Otis Pike, actually, in New York, which he says, what did the Liberty teach us, basically? And Moore kind of fumbled, and he says, well, we put a few more guns on it, we changed some communications protocols, etc. But what he doesn't say, and what is unwritten there, is that it really taught us nothing. Because that January morning in 1968, when the Pueblo was out there, everything happened the exact same way it happened there. A ship by itself, cut off, that ultimately was seized. That would lead to the loss of all this great intelligence. So, I think these things have a ripple effect that go throughout.